We just sang this wonderful song, Blessed Assurance, in which in the last verse are these words, where I lost my, where's my place? Yes, here we go. I and my Savior am happy and blessed, watching and waiting, looking above, filled with His goodness, lost in His love. It's lyrics about what we often experience as Christians, that joy, that love, that anticipation with Jesus of being with Him one day. But what happens when we don't feel that joy? What happens when we are down and out and depressed? Because it does happen. And so tonight we wanted to continue our look that we started about 3 weeks ago, before I left for Palm Desert and before we had our second Sunday singing. We were looking at certain characters in the Bible that were depressed, that went through times of depression, and seeing what we could learn from them. And the more I study this, the more I am just amazed at some of the things that come out about depression. And so I just want to quickly review what we were talking about before. We started off by talking about depression is a hard subject to talk about because it is different things to different people. It reveals itself in different ways. For example, probably the one that we're most familiar with, that we see a lot, that's very troubling, is what they would call clinical or chemical depression. And that type of depression needs professional help, and there's nothing to be embarrassed about that. There are medications that are needed to try to lead a healthy and fruitful life. That type of depression is very real. It can be real in Christians as well, but it is not the type of depression that we're talking about in this series. I don't believe that the characters we're looking at suffer from this type of depression. But the ones that we're probably more familiar with as far as a standpoint of what Christians go through is one I call a long-lasting depression versus a short-term depression. A long-lasting depression is people that are not chemically depressed, but people that just struggle for one reason or another to find joy in life, to find happiness. Their depression is very debilitating. It plagues them day in and day out, and it is very challenging. And oftentimes, unfortunately, to try to find some type of escape, some type of release, or what they might think is some type of healing, they'll turn to the wrong things. They'll turn to addictions. They'll turn to things like drugs and alcohol and things like that. And those things do not help them, maybe for a period of time, but it makes things worse. And then probably the one that most of us can relate to. We're joyful, we're happy people, but there are times where we do get depressed, and I call this short-term depression. It is times where we feel down, and experts would probably say this isn't really depression, but I'm not going to wrangle about words. People feel depressed, they feel down, whatever they want to call it. It is real for them, and they struggle to find happiness and motivation in life. And we've all done that. We've all gone through that at times. And what happens, and this is what we would hope for Christians, is that it's not wrong to get down or depressed, but hopefully we would, at some point say, we would bounce back and we would renew our relationship with Christ and start feeling that happiness and joy and become that creature that is more than a conqueror. And I think that's what happens to us. And that's what God expects of us. That we will get down, but we can't let that just keep us down. And so it's about rebounding, just like we rebound from sin and temptation. And so the two characters we looked at last time were Cain, and we also looked at Jonah, Cain and Jonah. And one of the interesting things that we saw in these depressed characters is that their depression came a lot from wanting to be in control, not liking what was happening or the conclusions that were coming about. Cain did not like the fact that God rejected his offering. He did not like the fact that his countenance fell, and he didn't like God's answer to it as well. So he'd rather have a different outcome, but he wasn't willing to do it God's way. Jonah in the same way. He didn't like God's plan of going and preaching to the Ninevites. And so he tried to run away, and he got very depressed as eventually he did it, and he saw God's forgiveness of the people. And so we're going to look at two more Bible characters tonight before we close. And the first one we're going to look at is Elijah. The second one we look at is going to be Job. And I think you say, well, Job, of course, right? But one thing I wanted to present to you when you, as we talk about Elijah and Job, one of the impressive things is that when you look at these depressed characters, a lot of them are not what you might expect. A lot of them are not like Cain, that struggle in faith and struggle to be faithful to God. I think probably most of us would say, well, that's the kind of people we would find and expect to be depressed. And we do find that in the Bible. But you have these characters that are far from being weaklings in the faith. In fact, they are some of the strongest disciples of God. In fact, God says of Job, he is my best disciple. He's the greatest of his time. And God so puts forth his number one disciple. And I think that's very telling, is that even those that are strong, dedicated in the faith, godly wives and women, elders, preachers, deacons, Bible class teachers, they can deal with depression. And so it's not a form of weakness. We see it in some of the strongest men and women of faith in the Bible. And we're going to look at two of those characters tonight. Another thing that is interesting is that a lot of times, not only do we see the depression coming from control issues, but we see it coming from things that make them depressed because of their relationship with God, a reaction to God. And I found that interesting because I would think that, again, a lot of depression that goes on, we think, well, we're down because of this or that happened, and so we're kind of down. But a lot of the depression we see in the Bible actually is because of this intimacy, this closeness with God, and not that they're always on the right side of the way they're viewing things. But I think that's probably true of us, that we get close to God and sometimes things aren't going the way that we expect them to go, and that might make us depressed, and we might say some things to God, and you see in that Bible, you see people expressing some deep depression and sorrow even about things that God is doing, and you see that in these depressed characters. And then finally, one of the things that's interesting, when you think of depression and how it shows itself, how it reveals itself, one of the things that you probably often think of is people being just kind of, like some of the pictures I've shown, is people kind of being depressed and down and just not motivated. And that's true, you see that. But a lot of what we see is a reaction of anger. Depression that leads to anger. And I'm not sure if we equate those two. That anger can be a sign of depression. But we saw it in Cain, did we not? We saw it in Jonah. And so keep your eye out for that as we go through some of this. But we're going to talk about Elijah, and if you would turn with me to Kings chapter 19. See if I think I have 1 chapter too quickly there. Let's see here. No, I do want chapter 19. Okay. So the story actually begins in chapter 18 and then carries on into chapter 19. And let me set up this story for you. Again, kind of rebounding on what kind of character Elijah is. He is one of the strongest men of faith and one of the strongest prophets you'll see. And I want you to think about this. This is a time where Israel is plagued with the ruthless Ahab and Jezebel. And they have brought their reign of tyranny for several years upon Israel. And God has had enough. And so you have two of the worst rulers ever in the history of Israel. And so what's God's response? I think it's impressive. God says, okay, well, I'm going to bring my strongest men of faith. I'm going to bring my strongest prophet, and it happens to be Elijah. And just to point this out, I want you to think about this. When you study about the prophets, where do you see the miracles in these prophets? You know, what miracles did Isaiah do? Jeremiah? Ezekiel? Yeah. But here's Elijah, and then after him, his successor Elisha, and they're doing miracles. And including the raising of the dead. That's not common among the prophets. And so here you have these great men of faith, prophets of God, and they are writing their story not literally, but through their faith in God, through God using them and showing His power over the most evil that Satan has, Ahab and Jezebel. And that's the thing that gives us courage. It should give us courage. As bad as things get in the world, God has an appropriate reaction. And it'll always be stronger than what Satan can offer. We may not see the strength of it right away. But when Ahab and Jezebel come on the scene, don't worry. God has an appropriate and an even stronger reaction to it. And in this case, it's the prophet Elijah. So our story is where Elijah is on the top of the mountain and then so quickly falls off that mountain to the base of the mountain of deep depression and despair. And it's kind of ironic because he is on a literal mountain. This is Mount Carmel. And remember, 3.5 years earlier, God sent Elijah to Ahab and said, I've had enough. It is not going to rain. There's going to be this great famine just to show you who is really in control and to show you that one in control, he is not happy with what's going on. And so there's been this great famine in which God is taking care of Elijah, setting him to, of all people, the Gentiles, to find nourishment and care. And so now at the end of that 3.5 years, there's this challenge up on Mount Carmel where Elijah is taking on the prophets of Baal. And you know the scene where they make 2 altars, one to Baal, one to God, and they call all day for Baal. Of course, he doesn't answer. He's a fake god. That's the whole point. And then Elijah gets his altar and he douses it with water. He makes it about as unflammable as possible, calls on God, and boy, God sends down His fire. Just licks it all up. And I can imagine that Elijah was so excited when he saw that. My first point in all this is that Elijah has dreamt of this day for over 3 years. And as that fire rains down and soaks up all that water and consumes that altar, Elijah is there to see Israel break their fear of Jezebel and bow the knee to Jehovah God. And then you remember, Elijah says, hey, go get the prophets of Baal and kill them. And what happens? Israel obeys. And the prophets of Baal are destroyed. And then Elijah runs. And he prays to God. And he has to pray several times. But then comes this little storm cloud that becomes a great storm cloud. And rain. It hasn't rained for 3.5 years. There is no food. There is no substance. People have died out of starvation. And all of a sudden it rains. And you can just see Elijah feels like this is victory. He's won he's dreamt of this day. We finally are getting rid of Ahab and Jezebel. Israel's bowing the knee back to God. They again, it's a victory. But as we read on, it's a victory for who? Let's now look at chapter 19, beginning verse 1. Now Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. And Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, so may God do to me, to the gods may do to me even more, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time. And I can just see Elijah saying, yeah, right. Israel is on our side. Not a chance. But look at verse 3. And he was afraid. And he arose and he ran for his life. And he came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah. And he left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. And he came and sat down under a juniper tree. And he requested for himself that he might die. And he said, it is enough now, O Lord. Take my life, for I am not better than my fathers. The text isn't real clear, but after studying this a long time, I think this is what's happened. As Elijah has felt, this is what I dreamt of. This is victory. And when Jezebel puts the death sentence on him, puts a bounty on his head, he's thinking, no, Israel's not going to do that. They've learned their lesson. They're back with God. And when they just turn like that and they come after him, he goes from the top of the mountain to the bottom. He goes from victory to failure. Because this isn't what he thought would happen. This isn't what he imagined would happen. And so what does he do? He's filled with fear. He is depressed. He runs away. He gets as far away as possible. In fact, we're going to read a little bit. He's going to go all the way back to Mount Sinai. Here it's called Horeb, which was another name for Mount Sinai. He's going to go all the way back to where it all started for Israel. And that's what people do when they're depressed. There's the sense of running away. Running away from that which makes me depressed. That which is fearful. And I totally understand that. But sometimes, before you can get better, sometimes what you have to do is you have to face what you fear. But you'll never be alone doing that. God will be with you. And I want you to notice that not only is he depressed and running away, he is depressed to the point of death. He says, God, take my life. It's over. There's no more hope. This is Elijah. You know, again, we kind of feel like people that have kind of this suicidal thoughts are people that are emotionally unstable, people that aren't full of faith. But in the Bible, we see quite the opposite. Here we have Elijah saying, God, take my life. We saw it in Moses. We're going to see it in Job. Some of the strongest Bible characters said, God, it's over. It's not worth it. And of course, God has a different answer here. And so he sends an angel, and the angel tells him to eat. And so what happens? Well, look down, if you would, verse 8. And so he arose and he ate and he drank. He went in strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights at Horeb, the mountain of God. And he came there, and there was a cave, and he lodged there. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he said, "I have been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts, for the sons of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, killed your prophets with the sword, and I alone am left. And they seek my life to take it away." And so he goes all the way to Horeb, and you've got kind of this deja vu moment. You got 40 days, 40 nights, Mount Horeb, Mount Sinai. Just like Moses was up on Mount Sinai, 40 days, 40 nights, God talking to him. But here God comes to Elijah, and he says, "What are you doing?" Almost like, "Elijah, you're not supposed to be here." And Elijah starts speaking to God why he's so depressed. Elijah has kind of this self-loathing, this self-pity. God, I failed. It didn't go well. And so it's over. I'm the only one left. You see, Elijah, his depression is, again, I think a lot of it is kind of a control issue. Things did not go the way he believed they should go. He thought he was going to be the prophet to destroy Ahab and Jezebel. He was the prophet that was going to bring Israel back to God. And that's what he dreamt of. And that's what he thought he had. But I think he was looking too much upon himself and about what he wanted and the way he dreamt of things happening, and not so much God. And when we do that, how quickly things can turn. How quickly the joy of victory can turn to the agony of defeat. And so, because things didn't happen the way Elijah believed they were going to, he becomes very distraught, very down, very depressed, even to the point where he says, "Take my life, because I'm the only one." You see kind of a Naaman character, right? Naaman had this whole idea how not only is going to be healed of leprosy, but how God was going to do it. And when that doesn't happen for Naaman, when the prophet doesn't come out and wave his hands and do this great pomp and circumstance healing of Naaman, but just makes it very simple. Go wash in the Jordan River 7 times. What happens? Naaman gets depressed. You see a lot of that in Elijah. And so now, what is God's answer? Well, I know that we like to have a big answer about how you regain your joy and all that. But in the Bible, God's answer is kind of simple. God, number one, says, "Elijah, guess what? You're not the only one. You're not seeing things straight, Elijah. I've got 7,000 who haven't bowed the knee to Baal." And then he goes on to say, "Now what I want you to do, get back there, get back to work. But I want you to do it my way. I want you to work my plan." And so he has him go appoint 2 kings and a successor, Elisha. And that's what Elijah does. He bounces back and he does God's plan. And it's not Elijah that brings an end to Ahab and Jezebel. And that's what he had to understand. God had a different plan and a different timetable. And I would say a lot of our depression, our downness sometimes comes, if we're honest, the same way. Because we have a way that we think God should work. And when he should work and all of that. And when it doesn't turn out that way, sometimes we can get very down and depressed. We get laid off from our job. And then this great job opportunity comes, and we look at that and we say, man, everything lined up perfectly. If I was in this job, I would never consider this job. And so we interview that job, and we just like we've been praying about this, and we know this is God's answer. And well, praise God, I just see how He works so well, and this is going to work out better. And then I'm going to go to the people that fired me, and I'm going to show them what a mistake that was because I got this better job, and it pays twice as much. And so you interview that job, and guess what? You don't get it. Well, what's happened? Well, it's great to have faith in God and get excited about it, but we need to be careful not to be so presumptuous about what God is doing and what God isn't doing. And if we do get presumptuous, we can get very, very depressed about it when it doesn't turn out that way. And so Elijah, a great prophet, a great man of faith, went through this incredible challenge to his faith. And what did he finally did? He bounced back. And probably the great thing is God rewards him because of his great faithfulness. Because he was so close to God. Wasn't always good at that, but because he was so close to God, God allows Elijah to be the second man, only the second man to depart this world without tasting of death. What a great way to exit. A great chariot of fire takes you up into heaven. Well, let's spend the remainder of our time in one more character. Oh boy, you can hardly see Job there. Too far away. Well, let's talk a little bit about Job, and we're just going to look at a couple passages here. Go over to Job, if you would, chapter 1. You're familiar with the story of Job. But Job is one that we would say if anyone has a reason to be depressed, Job has a good reason. And so in Job chapter 1, verse 13, very quickly, you know the story, but let's just kind of put it into our mind. Now, on the day when when his sons and his daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, "The oxen were plowing, and the donkeys feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans attacked and took them. And they also slew the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you." And while he was still speaking, another also came and said, "The fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you." And while he was speaking, yet another also came and said, "The Chaldeans formed 3 bands and made a raid on the camels and took them and slew the servants with the edge of his sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you." And while he was still speaking, another also came and said, "Your sons and your daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and behold, a great wind came from across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they died. And I alone have escaped to tell you." So Job, in the blink of an eye, is told about all of these losses. He loses all of these things. And let's go back to chapter 1, verse 2, just to get a sense of it. 7 sons and 3 daughters were born to him. 10 children he loses. His possessions were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and very many servants. And that man was the greatest of all the men of the East. I don't know if I've ever seen a field with 7,000 sheep. I haven't spent a lot of time in agriculture. I can remember when going through Corona on the 71. At some point, I don't even know if it's still like this, but at some point you go through this dairy farm. And you can smell it before you can see it. And there's a whole lot of cows, but I think it's probably hundreds of cows. 200-300 cows. But nothing like 7,000. I mean, try to picture what he's lost. And he's lost all of this in one day. And there's people that relate to Job. I've heard people say, I feel just like Job. And I totally understand what they're saying and what they're feeling. But I'm not sure if any of us ever can relate to Job. Have we lost a child? Some have. But 10? We've lost a house in a fire. But did you lose all your possessions and everything? He lost it all. And I think that is meant for us to be a sign of endurance, that no matter what we go through, it will never be as bad as Job. I just can't imagine that. Maybe, but... And if Job can weather that storm, then we can as well. But that's not the end of Job. You have, he loses his health in the midst of his depression. As he's mourning this, attack number 2, challenge number 2, Satan is now allowed to take his health, but not his life. And so as he's depressed, as he's dealing with all of this loss, he loses his health. Now, I understand that this is all from Satan, and Satan has touched him and taken away his health and challenged him that way. But this is a reality a lot of times when people are depressed. Things get worse because their health goes downhill as well. Depression leads to a deterioration of one's health as well. And so now you not only have a depressed person, you have a sick person, and it can be very, very, very challenging in those situations. So we know that his friends come, and they're very helpful at first because they don't say anything. And we know this point, but it bears reminding that sometimes when you're trying to help someone, when they're down and depressed, and you're like, I just don't know what to say, maybe that's the best thing you can do, is not say anything. I am not a good person in encouraging anyone, but sometimes I'll just say, I'm sorry, I don't even know what to say, but I'm going to sit here with you. And sometimes that calms someone and helps them a lot more than trying to come up with some cliche that sounds good, but does very little to console somebody. In fact, many of these cliches make things worse and make them angry. And so eventually they open up their mouths and they make things worse. You know, adding salt to the wound, as we like to say. And you can study the book of Job from both standpoints, from the sufferer to the one trying to help the situation. They're both valid studies. But it's good for us to think about, not only from the standpoint of us going through our depression, but how do we help somebody? And sometimes there's not a golden thing to say. There's no some golden solution. Sometimes it's just your presence there to help them. So Job's depression is not quite the same as what we've seen. I don't believe that Job is depressed because of control issues. I don't believe he's trying to be in control of things. Yeah, if he had his way, all of this would go away. But I think his depression is a little bit different, where he's ready to trust God. He's ready to accept God's answer. He just wants to figure it out. God, where are you? Why are you letting this happen? Just tell me what your plan is for me. And there's no answer. He knows what his friends are saying is not accurate. But God is not defending him. God's not showing Job to be right. And I think a lot of depression that Christians may feel is that type of depression. We're ready to accept your answer, God. Whatever you have for me, I'll accept. Just let me know what it is. But sometimes God says, I'm not going to tell you right now. Sometimes God challenges us and tests us by not responding. Sometimes God makes us wait. And I know there's a lot of people that would say, I don't want to serve a God like that. But sometimes we as parents show our greatest love. We call it tough love. And we let our kids go through struggles, and we're there to watch it. And eventually we'll step in. But sometimes we let our kids struggle, and we test them and we challenge them. Why? Because it helps them to grow instead of just taking the hurt away. Instead of just fixing it all the time. They've got to learn how to deal with hardships in life. And isn't it better when we can be there and watch them and help them and protect them? That's the kind of God we have, and that's the God I want. That's a truly loving God, because God is working His work in us. Let's look at Job chapter 3. Job chapter 3, verse 1. Afterward, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. Verse 3, let the day perish on which I was born, and the night which said a boy is conceived. Look at verse 11 and 12. Why did I not die at birth, says Job, come forth from the womb and expire? Why did the knees receive me, and why the breast that I should suck? He's not saying, just take my life, but he's saying it would have been better for me not to be born. Again, you have this strong man of faith going through this depression challenge, and it's so to the point where he wished he wasn't even born. Look at verse 25. For what I fear comes upon me, and what I dread befalls me. I am not at ease, nor am I quiet. I am not at rest, but turmoil comes. I love that. What I fear comes upon me. Aren't you afraid of that? Doesn't that lead to depression? You sit there and you're afraid. Oh, I was afraid that was going to come. You're afraid something's going to happen, and that's exactly what happens. And that can be a great challenge. And that's what Job says. The very thing I was afraid of has happened to me. I'm in turmoil. And so, depression leads to all sorts of crazy thoughts. It does. You hear people that are depressed and they say things and you're like, wow, it's normal. It's normal. But this is an expression of the pain and the turmoil that they're going through. And so as you look at Job, this is what he's going through. And finally, what's God's answer? How could we be helped? What's the answer? Well, first off, God's answer we all talked about, it was no answer. You keep reading chapter after chapter, and Job is defending himself, and he's praying to God, he's talking to God, he's talking to his friends. And where's God? He's silent. And that's some of the hardest time for us as Christians. When God says, wait. 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 But God says wait sometimes without saying a word. He doesn't tell us to wait. He just doesn't answer us yet. And that can be challenging. And then at the end of the book, God finally intervenes. And God sets it all right. But God is not happy. Especially with Job's friends. God is not happy because people have said things as if they just know it's all right. I know this is right when it's wrong. And sometimes when we are depressed, we say things like that. And ultimately, God says to Job and his friends, who was there when I created the world? And who is there that can separate the land from the oceans? Who can raise up the mountains and depress the valleys? Who is it that created gravity and yet lets the birds fly in the heavens? God, in essence, says, you just need to trust me. And so ultimately, we're left with this message that as bad as things get, and as depressed as we get, we need to believe and know and have confidence God doesn't leave us. If there's no answer for a reason. And ultimately, what sometimes we have to do with that faith and trust in God is just pull up our bootstraps and get back to doing God's will and trusting Him and trying to make the best of whatever trial, tragedy, or challenge is in our life. Telling someone just to snap out of it doesn't help. But God shows us in these depressed characters some of the great lessons about depression. Depression is real. But from a biblical standpoint, again, it manifests itself in a lot of ways. But sometimes we bring on depression by our own choice. Not always, but a lot of times. Wanting to be in control. Wanting for sinful things. As James talked about to his Christian audience. Having a negative perspective. And so the ultimate question, are we going to let God be in control of our life? Are we going to accept Him and His rule? And I'll tell you what, if we are, even when we're down and depressed, then God can help us. If you're in need of that help tonight, why don't you let that be known as together we stand and as we sing.